It's really my pleasure to introduce Fiorella Retucci, and I'm indebted to Nicola, as in so many other ways, for bringing to my attention the work of many colleagues working in English Franciscan thought, but especially Fiorella. If I understand correctly, you're working on an edition of Thomas of York's Sapientiale right now, which is obviously a massive undertaking, and I hope we'll hear a little more about it, and trust we will, but also such a tremendous contribution that we're all looking forward to so much. And I noticed that you also have done editions of Durandus of Saint-Pourçain and a number of other major medieval thinkers. So this is just incredible work for which we're all grateful, those of us who rely on those editions. Fiorella is junior professor of medieval philosophy at the Thomas Institute of Cologne, if I understand correctly. Do I have that right? Or has it changed? Okay, fantastic. At the Thomas Institute in Cologne, and is going to share with us today about her current work on Thomas of York. And I'm extremely grateful to you for being here with us, and just look forward to actually meeting you in person someday as well. So let me hand it over to you, Fiorella, and thank you.
So thank you very much. Good afternoon again, everybody. And thank you very much, Lydia, for the kind invitation, also for the very kind presentation. And I think that you can also look at my PowerPoint on, I don't know, somehow in your on your desktop. So, and if you have no problem, then I can begin with my text. Okay. So, the Sapientiale of Thomas of York was first brought to public attention in the Histoire de la philosophie médiévale, first published in 1900 by Maurice de Wulf. Up to that point, the name of the English Grey Friars was only occasionally mentioned by specialists of the early Franciscan school at Oxford. An announcement in 1919 of the forthcoming publication of the Sapientiale by the commission at Quaracchi engaged in the edition of the Summa Fratis Alessandri merited merely a footnote in an article by August Pelzer concerning the Latin translation of Aristotle's ethical works. Two articles by Longpre remarkably increase our knowledge of Thomas of York and announced for the second time the imminent publication of a critical edition of the Sapientiale. Since that time, few studies have been devoted to Thomas of York. The evaluation of Thomas' work has been almost unanimous. For Martin Grabman, the great historical meaning of his work would lie in the fact that it was elaborated not by a peripatetic, but by an authentic Augustinian. Longpre was more or less of the same opinion, so much so that he defined the philosophical system of Thomas of York as a form of Augustinism integral. In an article with a rather explicit title, Great Fighters Against Averroism, published in 1930, Christoforos Sianic speaks of Thomas' expressly anti-Averroistic attitude. Sianic indeed writes, "When Thomas of York set about synthesizing the philosophical knowledge of the ancient world within a framework of evangelic ideas, he had to decide to absorb either Hellenic and Arabic rationalizing Aristotelianism or Neoplatonism in the traditionalism of St. Augustine, Anselm, and St. Bernard, who until the 13th century had imprinted their ideas on all matters. Thomas of York, for the first, and all the Franciscan masters followed him, chose. He absorbed traditional philosophy in order not to touch the sanctity of dogmas with the acceptance of Aristotelianism. Thomas was a Franciscan and could not choose otherwise. He could not prefer Aristotle to Augustine. It is always theology that appears in every statement of Franciscan thought." Quotation end. Giulio Bonafede, in his book Il Pensiero Francescano, published in 1952, was convinced that there is no difference between Bonaventure's philosophical system and that of Thomas of York. And so Bonafede prefers to describe Thomas' arguments by quoting some Bonaventure, endowed, in his opinion, with greater clarity of exposition than his English confrere. Edgar Scully also concludes that for Thomas of York, the Augustinian tradition, after sacred scripture itself, is and remains the very embodiment of Christian wisdom, to such a degree that Aristotle or any other philosopher could not essentially alter the time-honored doctrines of Augustine, Boetius, and Anselm. Also for Scully, the doctrinal content of the Sapientiale would be nothing more than a representation of the Augustinianism prevalent at that time. According to scholarly literature, Thomas of York, a radical Augustinian, would therefore, together with Bonaventure and Alexander of Hales, be the founder of a uniform Franciscan tradition that would later be inherited by William de la Mare, John Peckham, Peter John Olivi, Peter of Trabibus, and Richard of Middleton. More than a century after the first announcement of the publication, the text of the Sapientiale is beginning in recent months to see the light in a modern edition. So the third book has just been published and the first is in print. Perhaps it is too early to attempt a definitive evaluation of a work as complex and long as the Sapientiale, and this is not even the purpose of this paper. Quite the contrary, my purpose today is to propose only a mere footnote on the apparatus foncium of the work, while at the same time trying to draw some conclusions from the textual evidence. And I hope not to disappoint the audience, but the analysis that I will carry out in the next few minutes is based exclusively on the explicit sources mentioned in the Sapientiale and not with the implicit one. So excuse me for this. Written between 1250 and 1259, 1260, while Thomas was at Oxford and Cambridge, the Sapientiale constitutes a complete metaphysics of being, beginning with an investigation of the existence, nature, and properties of God, proceeding to a doctrine of creation, followed by an inquiry into the division of being in general, and ending with a special metaphysics of physical being, which remained unfinished. Thomas constructs his incomparable monument of philosophical knowledge in the 13th century, to use the words of Maurice de Wulf, by collecting a massive number of theological and philosophical sources, so much so as to elaborate a true synthesis of Greek, Arab wisdom and Christian wisdom. His familiarity with classical authors prefigures, at an early date, the English medieval attitude towards antiquity, which characterized the so-called classicizing group of friars presented in the pioneering, well-documented study English Friars and Antiquity in the early 14th century, published in 1960 by Maurice Bolli. In the Sapientiale, Apuleius, Hermes, Cicero, the elder Pliny, Seneca Rhetor, Lucius Annius Seneca, Valerius Maximus, and Macrobius, all called Sapientes Mundi, join Arabic, Jewish, and patristic authors called Sapientes Dei in a clear attempt to realize a synthesis of Christian and philosophical wisdom. An unpublished study by Virginia Brown allows us to quantify the use that Thomas made of the Latin classics in composing his work. In the Sapientiale, Cicero is mentioned by names 365 times, 56 times, excuse me. Although most of the quotations concern Ciceronian works well known in the Middle Ages, Thomas of York also shows that he was familiar with minor works, He quotes many times the Divinazione and also many times the Paradoxa. Alongside the Latin classics, the Sapientiale is deeply influenced by other sources, which we could divide into three distinct groups. So we have ancient philosophers called by Thomas Sapientes Mundi. Then we have medieval Latin authors called Sapientes Dei. And then we have Arabic and Jewish authors, sources, also defined by Thomas Sapientes Mundi. The philosophical sources of the Sapientiale have in no way a merely decorative function. This is already evident from purely quantitative evidence if we take into consideration three case studies on which the attention of scholarly literature has been focused in recent years: the Hermetic tradition, the Liber de Causis, and Averroes. So let us begin with the first, the Hermetic tradition. Thomas of York is one of the authors who in the Middle Ages referred to the authority of philosophical Hermetic texts to a greater extent. Moreover, in the Middle Ages, Thomas of York was the author who used the Asclepius most intensively, as Paolo Lucentini and David Porreca have shown. The number of passages where Thomas quotes this text alone in the Sapientiale, 193 times, surpassed the references to Hermes in Albertus Magnus' entire corpus, 87. With very few exceptions, Hermes is mentioned by Thomas of York in a positive way, in the sense that he is quoted in support of Thomas' point of view, as David Porreca demonstrated in his excellent study on the Hermetic sources in the Sapientiale. For this reason, Porreca concludes that there is no doubt that Thomas, more than any other writer of his time, relied on and was influenced by Hermes. Thomas of York's Sapientiale represents, for Porreca, the high point of the influence of Hermes Trismegistus during the Middle Ages. On one point in particular, the influence of Asclepius is, in my view, particularly significant, and this for at least two reasons. First, Thomas of York quotes a passage from Asclepius that had no particular fortune in the Middle Ages. I'm referring to Asclepius 22, and this is exactly the text you have now on your PowerPoint. Second, Thomas of York uses this quotation from Asclepius, so the Asclepius 22, to describe the nature of the human being in a way that was very unusual for the medievals. With regard to the human condition, Asclepius' authority is invoked by Thomas in three crucial texts. The first one is exactly this one. And this text is in the third book of the Sapientiale. Thomas does not lack a firm conception of human unity. In the Sapientiale, there is no sign of contempt for the corporeal universe. On the contrary, Thomas suggests that the human being has something in common with all parts of the universe, being a smaller world, a microcosm. Humans are truly included in the same genus as animals. However, they are also much more, as their nature transcends the nature of animals, being formed by a corporeal and by a divine part. For this reason, the human being is the perfection and the final end of everything. So omnium perfectio et consummatio et finis omnium. The second text is this one, and this text is in the second book of the Sapientiale. As you can read in this text, Thomas clearly maintains that the body has its own value and dignity. The coexistence of a spiritual and a corporeal nature suits indeed human beings for their unique and exalted role in comparison with the rest of creation. Thomas sketches this idea, which constitutes the basic element of his concept of human freedom and dignity, again on the basis of a quotation from Asclepius, as you can see. And it's always the Asclepius 22. With the help of this text, Thomas shows how the human being is given a double nature, a mortal as well an immortal and divine one, that is a body as well as a soul. The body is given with the purpose of exercising the soul, ad anima exercitium, in order to reach the very goal of the human being and to increase its merits, propter augmentum meriti. The third text is in the first book of the Sapientiale, and this is this text. From Thomas' words, one point is, in my opinion, evident. For Thomas, immortality is not a free divine gift, but an achievement. Humans, being between two worlds, can by choice become mortal or immortal. Their dignity as well as their immortality do not depend on their nature, but they are the result of a personal conquest. For the human being, a mortal nature and the very possibility to sin are neither punishments, nor are they the result of the fall from an original perfect condition. They are rather opportunities to achieve immortality by choice. The human being alone is responsible for realizing in actuality the immortality that he has potentially. Because of their power to choose between good and evil, and consequently their freedom to choose the mortal or the immortal part, the human beings are even better than the other divine substances, such as angels. The angels are not equipped, contrary to the human beings, to choose freely, since they are created only according to an immortal nature, and thus cannot sin. For Thomas of York, there is a strong sense that the human being cannot simply derive its nature from a predetermined God-given project. Each human being must create their own essential value themselves. Far from being passively inspired by the traditionalism of St. Augustine, Anselm, and St. Bernard, as Shanich believed, this text seems to me to be very close to what Eugenio Garen has identified as the leitmotif of Pico's Oratio de Hominis Dignitate. What the human being is must depend, above all, on what the human being does. What Thomas here is telling us is quite clear. As an animal among other animals, the human being alone is equipped to reach the level of immortality. And this happens, as Asclepius maintains, with the help of reason and learning. Let me now move on to my second case study. This is the Liber de Causis. As many studies of the last years on the medieval reception of the Liber de Causis clearly revealed, the Liber de Causis was a very important source of metaphysical doctrines within the Dominican order, but it had been read with suspicion and disinterest by the Franciscans. Bonaventure, one of the first Franciscan masters who used the Liber abundantly, does not hesitate to openly criticize and condemn as heretical some doctrines contained in the Causis. In the Sapientiale, Thomas of York shows a deep confidence in his use of the Causis and quotes this text several times. Thomas refers literally or explicitly to the Liber de Causis 107 times within il Sapientiale. Thomas uses the De Causis, and together with it other Sapientes Mundi, to correct and rectify the interpretation that some Sapientes Dei have given of particular doctrinal problems. A significant case can be found in the third book. In chapter 11 of the third book, Thomas deals with the question whether the first cause is the immediate agent in every action, or whether in any action there is an intermediary. An in omni actione non tantum creationis, sed etiam eductionis, sit ipse primus immediate agens, an in aliqua actione agat per medium. Thomas introduced the discussion of this problem with the statement that God is by necessity the efficient cause of everything. The causality of the first cause extends over all creatures, since the first cause is more powerfully the cause of everything than the subordinate causes, as the causes maintains. And what causes the cause also causes everything else, as Nicolas of Amiens says. After this premise, Thomas first calls attention to the opinion according to which God is the only immediate agent and the only true cause. The creature is by no means an agent, but just an occasion for the causal activity of the first cause. Thomas notes that this opinion is supported by the authority of some Christians, and in particular by Augustine's statement in Is de Civitate Dei, in the Genesis ad Litteram, and in the Trinitate. The Creator is the sufficient and unique cause of every action. It does not admit any co-actor. This is because the Creator is close to every creature, most intimately present to them, since he alone can enter into the essence of the creature. However, this doctrine is clearly rejected by the philosophers, especially by Averroes. Thomas then alludes to a second, more persuasive opinion, according to which every natural agent is the proper cause of what is generated. Natura non tantum est occasio, sed causa per suam actionem naturalem in generationem eorum quaefiunt. For this viewpoint, shared by some sapientes mundi, it is some philosophers, such as Averroes, Aristotle, and Maimonides, the production of particular beings by educing their forms from the potency of matter is due to an eductor, which is of the same genre and close to the deduced being. But since the first cause, existing outside every genus, has nothing in common with created beings and is related to effects always in the same way as the causes asserts, the differences present in the effects must derive from the differences in the causes. This means, beyond God, there are other secondary causes which are responsible for the differences present in created natures. The creature is thus not an occasion for the first cause to induce forms into matter, since it acts as a true agent beyond the first cause. For Thomas, the interpretation given to Augustine by the supporter of the first position is therefore wrong. Augustine's real intention was to sustain God's genuine contribution in the secondary causality, as well as to affirm his primacy in the production of effects in nature, according to what the causes says in the first proposition. This means that an authentic interpretation of Augustine's words is possible only in the light of the causes. Hence, Thomas is able to maintain the secondary causality while at the same time safeguarding the efficacy of the first cause over its effects. God's primacy over its creatures does not imply the negation of a legitimate secondary causation in nature. On the contrary, even if the first cause is sufficientissimus agens, it wants to have co-actors. On the basis of the causes, Thomas is able to combine the primacy of the first cause with the efficacy of the secondary causes. The causes plays a special role in Thomas' doctrine. Contrary to what Bonaventure did, Thomas does not condemn as heretical any doctrine of the causes. Quite the contrary, with the help of this text and of other philosophical authors such as Averroes, Aristotle, and Maimonides, Thomas is able to firmly respond point by point to a kind of Christian occasionalism, and moreover, to correct a wrong Christian interpretation of Augustine. Now, I'll briefly turn to my third case study. This is Averroes. Far from being a great fighter against Averroism, Thomas of York constantly refers to Averroes' authority in his work. The name of Averroes appears more than 1,000 times in the Sapientiale, and to this must be added a very long series of literal but implicit quotations. With the only exception of the doctrine on the eternity of the world, Averroes is called into question by Thomas only to support his own doctrines. That is to say, Thomas criticizes Averroes only and exclusively with reference to the doctrine of the eternity of the world. To the eternalistic model, however, Thomas does not oppose the Augustinian lesson, but the reading that Moses Maimonides had given to the problem. Thomas defends Averroes even when he would seem to deny God a knowledge of singular things. Averroes' conclusion on the divine knowledge of individuals is false, yes, but only from a formal, linguistic, not real point of view, so non tantum in re sed sermone. Thomas follows Averroes, also quoting a text that remained almost unknown to the medievals, the prologue to the 8th book of the Physics. As many scholars have already noted, few medieval authors followed Averroes on this point. The only traces of the presence of this passage in the Latin Middle Ages can be found, so far I know, in the Auctoritates Aristotelis, in Alberic de Reims, in an anonymous master of arts at Paris, and in Henri Bate. In all cases, however, these are very brief quotations. Far from being a great fighter against Averroes, Thomas of York is the only author known to me who in the late Middle Ages used almost entirely and explicitly the prologue to the 8th book of the Physics, as you can see in the synopsis. And I do not analyze this text in detail at the moment, and for now it is sufficient just to have a visual impression of the massive use that Thomas of York makes of this text. So, as you can see, also on the left column, you have the Averroes text on the, on the left, yes, and on the right, you have Thomas of York. I don't know your perspective, excuse me. And as you can see, the text of the prologue to the 8th book of the Physics is quoted almost entirely by Thomas of York. And I will come back to the importance of this text from a philosophical point of view in the next few minutes. So, but not at the moment. Beyond these case studies, the investigation of the explicit sources of the entire first book is quite significant. In the first book, which deals with existence, nature, and properties of God, so the first book, which is the most theological one, the match between the Sapientes Mundi and the Sapientes Dei is clearly uneven. As you can see in this chart, the Sapientes Mundi, among which Thomas includes Aristotle, Plato, Averroes, Avicenna, Hermes, Avicebron, Maimonides, and Algazel, are mentioned explicitly 1,267 times. The Sapientes Dei, represented above all by Augustine, Boëthius, Dionysius Areopagite, Gregory the Great, Anselm, John Damascenus, and Bernard, are mentioned explicitly only 397 times. These figures alone might be sufficient to prove the interest of Thomas of York in the Hellenic and Arabic rationalizing attitude that Sянich wanted to see as the sworn enemy of Thomas of York. This data becomes even more interesting if we try to understand the true nature of the Sapientiale. The method and the purpose of this work are openly declared by the author in the first 4 introductive chapters. First and foremost, the Sapientiale is a work written by a theologian for the purpose of coherently systematizing the doctrines of the philosophers in the clear attempt to realize a synthesis of Christian and philosophical wisdom. In the dense interweaving of sources that is his work, Thomas moves easily, pursuing a specific goal. His intention is to demonstrate that even though the source of all knowledge is only one, the truth can manifest itself in two ways. In authoritative way, that is, through the Holy Scripture, and in rational way, to the philosophical science. There is then a distinction between a theological, authoritative wisdom and a philosophical, rational wisdom, since philosophy and theology are separate and distinct in their methodology. And if authoritative knowledge, secundum traditionem auctoritatis, allows a wide participation of human being in wisdom, so much so that many can be wise knowing the contents of revelation, rational knowledge is a difficult task. This wisdom, secundum probationem rationis, is accessible only to a few. That is why it is said that there are not many wise people. The English Franciscan does not content himself at all with delimiting the fields of investigation and fixing precise rules of non-interference between theology and philosophy, but establishes also a real hierarchy in which greater value is attributed to rational investigation and not to pure and simple belief in the precepts of faith. Human beings are like the servants described by Moses Maimonides in the third book of Dux Neotrorum. Some servants are so far from the king's palace that they cannot see the walls. Others not only enter the king's palace, but may also look directly into the king's face. They are those who are advanced in philosophical studies and perfect in every science. The approach to the Creator is achieved only through the perfection in the sciences, so that only the perfect in the sciences can be addressed to the king and see his face. There is therefore no need for a free divine intervention into human life. Thanks to their own intellectual faculty, the human beings alone are responsible for the perfection of their own nature. Human beings can emancipate themselves from bestiality and, by their own effort, obtain the dignity of humanity. The dignity and the superiority of the human being over the other animals depends exclusively on wisdom and cognition, which is an instrument of the reason. Beatitude, by which the human being becomes God through participation, is not the fruit of divine illumination or of a free divine gift, but a result of an intellectual human act, as Thomas argues in a long quotation from the prologue to Book 8 of Averroes' Commentary on the Physics that, as I already mentioned, remained almost unknown to the Middle Ages. Thomas therefore follows Averroes also on a point where few medieval theologians did so. Through an intellectual act, the human being can join and be assimilated to God. The perfection in the speculative sciences leads the human beings to fully realize their humanity and to obtain eternal life, maintains Thomas, following on this point Averroes. Instead of being the point of departure of an anti-Averroistic struggle within the Franciscan order, which saw Bonaventure as a protagonist, Thomas of York seems to embrace the fourth thesis condemned at Paris in 1277. There is no better way to live than philosophically. Thomas is convinced of one fact. Every divine revelation is superfluous to the well-exercised human intellect. Philosophers, in the absence of any revelation or grace, are able not only to reach a partial knowledge of God through an oblique vision, but they can also enjoy a direct and perfect vision of the divine substance. The directa dei visio does not constitute an alternative to the laboriosa investigatio of the philosophers. Quite the contrary. The philosophical pursuit makes the direct vision into God's essence possible. On the basis of a pure rational investigation, it's not only possible to prove God's existence, but also God's unity and Trinity. No human being is indeed deprived of the knowledge of God. The idea of God is in fact naturally present to the human intellect. The very existence of God can be proven on the basis of exclusively rational arguments. For Thomas, the cognitive possibilities of philosophical reason are not limited to the pure and simple demonstration of God's existence, but also extend to the knowledge of God's peculiar qualities, such as his uniqueness. While some philosophers seem to affirm the contrary, they do not say the false. Their error consists only in an improper use of terminology. Finally, philosophical reason is able to access the same Trinitarian mysteries. Plato, as you can see in the slide, spoke of the second person of the Trinity, and with him, Hermes and the Sibyl agreed. And again, continues Thomas, philosophers not limit themselves to talking about the generation of the Son, but also penetrated the mysteries with regard to the third person of the Trinity. Hermes mentioned the third person. Atticus Easter clearly described the Trinity. Seneca and Cicero treated in detail the operations of the third person, and also Averroes understood and described the Trinity. In the words of Thomas of York, the myth of ancient wisdom and philosophical revelation lives again. In the Sapienziale, we have no difficulty in finding a new definition of philosophy. No longer a science subordinate to theology, but perfect and self-sufficient wisdom. In the recovery of the sapiential tradition of the Sapientes Mundi, Thomas of York discovered the premises to found the union and concordance between revelation and philosophy, not in the sense of integrating pagan wisdom into the Judeo-Christian system of relation, but rather with the purpose of legitimating the autonomous and independent coexistence of both. To conclude, Christopher Ossianic was convinced that Thomas of York for the first, and all the Franciscan masters followed him, chose. He absorbed traditional philosophy in order not to touch the sanctity of dogmas with acceptance of Aristotelianism. In my opinion, it is too early, and it would go beyond the limits of this paper to evaluate the role played by Thomas of York in establishing a Franciscan philosophical tradition. On one point, however, I hope to have been able to make a small contribution. Far from being a theological work marked by Augustinian traditionalism, in my opinion, the Sapienziale has all the features of a history of philosophy written by a theologian in order to legitimize the claims of philosophy to be an all-encompassing science of reality and a valid science of divine. Thank you very much for your attention.